Welcome to the Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary review, episode 1, brought to you by Game Up Hard Hydration. It's like your favorite sports drink, your favorite seltzer, got together, had a baby, but it's so much better. Dave, let them know about it.
All right. We're talking about fruit punch, orange, lemon lime, and grape. Those are the 4 flavors that come in an 8-pack. And guys, it's only 110 calories per can. It's low carb. Enjoy yourself some Game Up.
We are talking about the much talked about currently Netflix documentary, Mr. McMahon. We're going to go episode by episode. Instead of giving it to you like post wrestling in 6 days, you're going to get an episode a week. And before we really get into the notes on the show, if you're interested about this documentary, if you want to dig deeper into the Vince McMahon story, there are 3 really good books on the subject. You've got Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America, written by Abraham Josephine Reisman. This is the newest book to have come out. And then there are 2 older books. There's Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, the real story of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Entertainment, Mike Mooneyham and Sean Sal, and Capital Revolution, The Rise of the McMahon Wrestling Empire, written by Tim Hornbaker. I own all 3 of these books. I've only read the first 2 I mentioned. And so if I reference things from that I know other than the story, I can't remember which of these books it came from. I told Dave yesterday I thought it was almost definitely from the Ringmaster book, but having listened to Post Wrestling's review, it could have been one of the 2. So first episode, named Junior, really kind of covers the beginning of Vince's life, vaguely getting into WrestleMania 1. Before we go note by note on the show, Dave, what did you think of episode
1? What I liked about it was a lot of the footage that we're going to see. Like some of it that I didn't actually recognize. For the most part, I thought it was enjoyable, entertaining, but it kind of set the tone that I wasn't going to necessarily discover anything new. This wasn't going to be breaking any new ground for me. But it set up a great chronological documentary. I thought it really set the tone well.
It did set the tone because they introduce Vince, they get him into the ring. Vince says he doesn't like talking about himself, doesn't really know who he is.
Right.
And then, briefly after that, they show the allegations. And then, just a quick rundown of them. And that gets interesting as things go on. Because then you see, like, all right, this guy doesn't like talking about himself. He's probably not going to give up much. And you get that from the first big quote of the documentary. I wish I could tell you the real stories. Holy shit.
Yeah.
And it's almost like in his own head, he realized what he said when, like, he gets the reaction. Because he's like, no, I'm not going to tell you the real stories. I don't want you to know who I am. And that was maybe not word for word, but pretty close. And he says, I'll give you enough so it's semi-interesting. Oh, yeah. I'll give you enough so it's semi-interesting. I don't want anyone to really know me. Right. And when you get that from the start, that's kind of a rough way to start your subject talking about themselves.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, because later on we'll hear Bruce saying why he didn't like it because he thought it was a got you piece. But, like, man, right there, right from the get-go, like, that's what he's saying. Like, do you not know how these documentaries work? Like, they're interviewing you, and this is going to go out there, and they're going to put out there what, they deem makes sense and what works for the documentary. And I'm glad they did include that because that really is a great sign of how Vince really thinks. He doesn't really want you to know who the real Vince is. And he probably doesn't know who the real Vince is as we go through this thing.
Yes, and then it goes on to kind of introduce wrestling around that time, meeting his dad, wanting to get into the business, meeting Linda, and you see her interviews in here talking about how when he got started, all he could talk about was getting into the business with his dad and promoting.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note too that his dad being away was something they never really addressed, and I thought that was fascinating too because um, I couldn't imagine like if I had a parent that was missing and come to find out like why were you gone, it'd be like the first thing I'd ask, like, where you been, you know?
Yeah,
But
they cover Vince's early life, and they don't talk about they don't mention his stepfather by name. So he wasn't even Vince McMahon till he was 12. He was, either known as Vinnie Lupton or Vincent Lupton up until that time because his stepdad was a Lupton. And it was interesting because, I mean, you hear about the abuse he caught. None of his brother didn't get it. It was only focused on him because he would speak up. And they don't cover a weird thing that I believe was in Ringmaster, where when he was young, Vince would talk about getting into fights with Marines that would come into town and how he was always getting into fights. And in that book, people don't really remember him as being a fighter.
yeah,
There might have been a couple fights here and there, but they don't remember it being the big thing that Vince made it out to be.
hmm, interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I could definitely see him being the kind of kid that fought. You know, like I just got done watching the story of Big George Foreman, and
Yeah,
when he was younger, poor, it didn't really cover any abuse. There was no dad they really talked about, so there could have been, but but they were poor, and Vince McMahon was poor, and I think a lot of kids that grew up poor in this time period that have rough lives were just angry and they just get into fights. You know.
makes sense. And as they start talking about Vince getting into promotion, they talk about how he started promoting in Bangor, Maine. And they go
Yeah.
right from talking about promoting in Bangor, Maine to Vince becoming an announcer
Yeah.
because an announcer was trying to hold his dad up for money. And his dad just decided, you know what, we got a guy, we'll plug him in. And I found that interesting because Bangor, Maine was, I believe, the first place he promoted. But he also made a name promoting in Cape Cod. They were promoting out of a building there, and then I think eventually they bought the building and they promoted concerts. They promoted hockey games. They promoted things like I got post wrestling reminded me of this, the Evil Knievel jump around that time. And that
Right.
was all in his rise as a promoter. And I thought it would have been interesting to cover, a couple more of those things. But as we're going to find, there were some topics on this documentary series that were kind of breezed over a little bit.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's so much you can do. I guess I'd like to see a documentary or something done on Vince McMahon Sr. That'd probably be interesting.
Yeah, because Vince McMahon Sr. himself was a second generation promoter
Right.
because his dad, Jess McMahon, actually was a boxing promoter in New York. And if I believe it was Jess McMahon that started getting linked up with the Garden, and then
Hmm.
eventually his son Vincent J. McMahon was able to pick it up from there.
Yeah,
So
that
that's
sounds.
all going off of memory from these books.
No, no. There's a story about I remember seeing on TV where they celebrated 3 generations of McMahon at the Garden. So it would definitely would have been Jess that started that.
Interesting. Now, one big thing, and one of the biggest takeaways that I really enjoyed from this documentary series was getting to hear Vince break down wrestling storytelling, kind of in a simple manner. And when you hear him explain it, how there's always the good guy, the bad guy, and then this
Mhm.
guy comes in, you can almost see the template for his wrestling booking over the years. And I thought that was an interesting insight. Like, Vince isn't going to purposely give you anything about himself, but from being able to see him talk about these things, a lot of times for the first time, it's interesting to see it in his own words. And I was glad they included this one a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's storytelling, and I don't know. I don't really have much to add on that. I mean, you know, that was all stuff that I think I had heard Vince talk before. Again, you're kind of laying the groundwork for everything. For me, the highlights, there's a few on here, but one of the highlights is Tony Atlas and some of the other people that are going to be interviewed here. And maybe some of the early edits that we see in this documentary too.
Oh yeah, so many great things. They go from Vince talking about wrestling storytelling to the whole story of buying the company
Yes.
and how that was interesting. And it was interesting. We talked about it off air yesterday. We might have talked about it during the show. But the way that Vince's dad set it up, that if you miss a payment, the whole
Yes.
company goes back to me. And you got to wonder, was that because he wanted to make it tough on his son? Is it because he had to have this hurdle to jump through? Or did he have a suspicion that his son could possibly screw him in business? Because we've seen Vince Jr. over the years set up big deals and go back on them. But this is the one deal he made it through. And he even said his dad was surprised when he gave him that last payment.
I think he said a lot of the guys that were involved that had money invested in that company were. One thing I thought was interesting too that was said too, that Vince said that Gorilla Monsoon was very leery of him at the time and looked at him as competition almost immediately when he came in. And they didn't say it, but I think Gorilla was the one. I know they said was interested. He was interested in selling possibly to Gorilla, and Gorilla might have been taking over Capital Wrestling. So I would imagine he would have had a heavy interest in that. It's fascinating to me because Gorilla's always been talked about with such respect, and to hear Vince say that he might have looked at him as competition is interesting because later on, like Gorilla was one of those guys that felt like they were untouchable in that company. That Vince made sure that Gorilla was always looked at, as a legend and had a job there until he didn't, until he was sick and old.
100%. Well, the thing was, it was Gorilla, it was Phil Zacco, it was
Yeah.
Arnold Skolin, I believe, that all had shares in Vince's dad's company. And I believe the documentary set it up that Gorilla was going to be the heir apparent. And it was interesting for Vince to say Gorilla looked at him as competition, and then Vince goes, because I was. And
Right.
when you hear later about competition, it's interesting that people like Arnold Skolin, that I believe Phil Zacco, that Gorilla Monsoon were taken care of for so long in that company because I mean it was the last time probably Vince really stuck to his word
Mhm.
with taking care of people. And to be fair, we don't know who he's taken care of and who he hasn't. But as far as the public story being out about it, those guys really were kind of untouchable in that time.
Yeah, Finn seemed to have a softer spot for wrestlers of that era, from what we hear. For the most part, there might have been some exceptions, obviously. But it was interesting because now we're going to lean in towards Vince wanting to do the expansion, and he said to his dad was really proud of him, but at the same time, this is where they started to have friction because he was going to do things that his dad would never do, like going into other territories. And this is where I really liked they had footage of Vince like at those old control centers talking about WWE coming to Los Angeles, St. Louis, or Hoboken, New Jersey. Like, we're going to be coming to a city near you. See, I grew up on that. So that just felt normal to me when I was a kid. But now I'm like, oh, this guy was changing the game at that point.
Yeah, I really miss that because you got those lists or coming to a city near you. And it was interesting hearing the process of how Vince competed with other promoters. And you can look at it different ways. He was stealing guys from a territory and then promoting shows in that area with that guy. You could view it as stealing. You could view it as, putting them on a bigger stage. And then, obviously you go to the place where they're popular. So business wise, it makes sense, but wrestling at that time wasn't doing that a lot. And a lot of the times Vince would try and work with the promoter in that area and buy their TV time, and then certain people didn't give in, and then it was poaching their stars, going on TV in their market with their stars, and they feel bigger. And it is something that they really feature throughout this, showing guys that were big in a territory and then doing that same thing on the WWF. And it's one of the first places where you get Tony Atlas in there. becoming a soundbite, but talking about this big thing that went on. I love the way this was presented too.
Yeah, I believe Tony was the guy that said Vince would grab him after everybody kind of already did the work to get other people over, and that's what Vince would just swoop in and offer him cash. And Tony's like, "It's a dog dog world, man." You know?
Yep. And the thing that you alluded to on the show yesterday that I thought was very interesting, they talk about the rise of Hulk Hogan kind of as the face of that early company, because they're going to talk about Hogan going away and coming back. But early on, Hogan considered face of that company. But who was also considered
Yeah,
possibly to be the
it was
face?
Dusty Rhodes, because Vince liked Bob back when he was the All American boy, but thought he was too, too cookie cutter, basically, and he thought he was too, just white toast, and he wanted somebody with a little more charisma, and he thought Dusty would have been that guy. And it was interesting because Cody said he remembers his dad saying that it almost just looked like it was just too big, like it was too big to really happen. And then Vince kind of just says, Dusty didn't, get the vision. So, we moved on and we started looking, and that's when they show the clips of the announcer coming in as Hulk Hogan turns, they show him from the upper body on up. This is not a figment of your imagination, right? And
yeah, the old Cape Hulk Hogan too.
Yeah. And so Hulk was that guy. So for me, it's fascinating because I like to wonder, the what if, like, what if Dusty Rhodes was the guy that they put all the money behind? I think he
You
was
took
more.
the question out of my mouth. I was going to ask you, what would the WWF have looked like around that time? Could they have gone to bigger heights than? Do you think they would have skyrocketed around that time?
I think they would have done some really good business, but I don't know if they would have growed because Dusty was part of that old school. He was so popular, but Dusty could evolve, but he would have probably done, traditional wrestling. Whereas Hogan was that superhero character. And part of that was because how he looked, and little kids wanted to be like that guy. They were drawn to that guy. And man, that kills me to say it because I love Dusty and I'd matter whatever. But when I think about it from a business standpoint, just looking at how it all played out, I think it had to be Hogan or somebody like a Hogan. It had to be that prototype.
Yeah, looking at it honestly, you could see they probably would have done real good business there for a while. They would have had some exponential growth.
Yeah.
But the downfall of that setup would have been Dusty having one view of the company, Vince having another view of the company, and the battles there. I heard on the post wrestling recap that this was right around the time that Dusty was wrapping up in Florida, and it sounded like he was going to Crockett as a wrestler and booker.
Right.
And that's also kind of a hard thing to turn down, but the WWF definitely would have had a different look about it, I think, if Dusty had been in there.
Yeah, no doubt. But yeah, I think
you
needed somebody that looked like Hogan at the very least. That was going to be the one that was going to appeal to kids. You were looking for that superhero at that time.
Talking about superhero, you got the super giant. They talk about Andre coming in and kind of how that was early. They discuss Hogan leaving the WWF for the Rocky movie.
Yeah.
And then Hogan returning to WWF, and they take off in the 80s. Just skyrocketing the business at that time.
I mean, that's huge too. The Rocky movie. I mean, that's a big thing. I remember even before Hogan coming to WWF, that Rocky movie took place, and that started off his popularity. Yeah, that's fascinating. In a lot of ways, Sylvester Stallone kind of helped with the pro wrestling boom too by giving Hulk Hogan that part.
Definitely. And I love this episode for all the footage because obviously this is around when I started watching, a little before, but it gets into it. I loved seeing them talk about the idea of the transitional champion, that you couldn't have the belt just go from Backlund to Hogan. And it was interesting talking about using foreign stereotypes as heels. And would you say this is Tony Atlas's most insightful comment about wrestling mirroring American culture?
It's interesting. And what was the comment he made here? Help me out.
Oh, I don't have the exact quote, but it was something like that. Like, wrestling. If you want to know what American culture is like, wrestling's gonna give it to you.
Right. He didn't swim uphill too, was something that he said talking about Vince. He didn't swim upstream. He saw
Yeah,
that,
that's why I had it as using foreign stereotypes as heels because he would, yeah, lean into those things. And especially around that time, Iran was a big subject.
I think it was really fascinating. There's a line they had from fans. Why don't you like the Iron Sheik? And someone's like, because he's from another country.
I love that because the kid himself didn't have an opinion, but you see like an older brother or a dad like
yeah.
talking into his ear, and it was really highlighting that it was that playing into fears, playing into stereotypes, and it's weird because anywhere else in life that's racism, but in pro wrestling that's just making a good heel. And I think you see things like that, and you're like, oh man, what kind of business is this?
But that was definitely the time period too at the time, So, crazy.
Oh, 100%. You get into the rise of Hogan and how he became this cultural landmark. And then they talk about the death of Vince Sr. And it was interesting because it's the first time Vince heard "I love you" from his dad. This wasn't the time where he heard his dad was proud of him, but there was some point after his dad got out of the business. And I think it was when he was trying to actually let go because a lot of the time you'd have a lot of these other promoters coming to Vince Sr. and talking about Junior. And the one thing that was funny was Vince talking about the threats having him end up at the bottom of a river, which we all know what that is. But Vince plays it off like, I don't know, it's a bunch of guys. They seem to have this fascination with bottoms of rivers. And it's like, no, you were upending the business, violating agreements that had been all around. Your dad had to answer for it. And then sometimes after it, his dad had said, you know what, Vinny, these guys aren't friends of mine. They are all in competition. Fuck them all. And I've heard that multiple places, but it was interesting to hear Vince tell that.
Yeah. This is also when you talk about the first time, his dad had said, I loved you. And then, he passed away shortly after. So it was really great to hear that from somebody you cared about. And then we had the edit straight to Tony Atlas. I don't think he liked his dad, which just makes me laugh. And they're like, he would make decisions that would drive him crazy. We all thought he was crazy.
And yeah, we'll get into that. That comes up more in a later episode, but it's setting that stage for things. And I mentioned this to you off air the other day, and we didn't get a lot into Vince and his other family because I believe it was in the Ringmaster book, they talked to one of Vince Sr.'s nieces, and she talks about his other family being so loving and that Vince Sr. would, constantly be telling them he loves them and constantly they knew they were in a warm house. Right. It sounded like a loving family that he had. So maybe there was some kind of resentment from Vince Jr. there. And even though he had the respect for his dad and loved his dad, didn't necessarily feel it. And these are all themes that they're introducing now that just get bigger and bigger as the episodes and the show goes on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think. What was the last thing that was really addressed in this series too, on this episode? The big thing.
Oh, we got. All right, so yeah, we're closing up here, and it's really just the rise of the WWF in the 80s, talking about how TNT was fun for Vince. Others thought he was crazy. They show him working with Letterman, which you said you remember seeing live around that time.
Yeah, so that's funny because that's the last thing I had written down, and was wondering how close you were to that because, yeah, I remember that as a kid, and I had not remembered that until I saw this documentary, and I could have only been like 5, 6 years old, but I remember my mom going, "Hey, look, it's that guy from wrestling on TV," and we didn't even know he was the promoter or anything. I think we found that out later, but yeah, so that was kind of interesting because I thought he was just an announcer. And I thought, oh, the announcer for wrestling does this too. Oh, this must be like his job. He announces things,
And it was interesting to hear that Bob Costas was the other person
Right.
covering stuff on that same segment. So once again, just interesting seeing these people that have this relationship to Vince or have had this opinion of Vince over the years, have worked with him in these certain ways. And it goes from that to coming up with the idea of WrestleMania while on vacation. Goes to the story of John Stossel covering wrestling.
Yes.
And I believe it was Hogan, another thing that's going to come up, getting the idea that Stossel wasn't there for the idea that he was, running to Vince, telling him that this guy, it looks like he's trying to expose wrestling, and them clearly laying out, or I think it was Tony Atlas that said it, that Vince didn't tell us to hit him, but like almost that it was implied, saying he wishes somebody would. They cover Dr. D hitting. What's that?
He basically said, "I wish someone would teach that guy a lesson," and then he said that in front of all the boys, and then he just left.
100%. And then you get into Dr. D hitting Stossel. It was interesting. Dr. D wasn't interviewed for this because that's almost somebody you would think you would want to talk to about this, because around that same time you had the Hogan with Richard Belzer incident.
Right.
And you can see the clip there, and it's one of those things where, did Vince think that was a thing in editing? Because, I mean, obviously it doesn't look good when you imply that Vince wanted somebody to slap Stossel. Then you see what happens with Hogan and Belzer. And it's really more about protecting the business, I think. But if you have just a general knowledge of wrestling, it could look like that's what Vince was telling people to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Hogan admits that Vince was not happy with him with the Belzer situation. But yeah, I don't, it's funny. Yeah, it definitely looks more like Belzer might have prodded him a little bit, not to excuse Hogan choking him out. But it was interesting too, because it never really looked like Hogan necessarily applied a lot of pressure, but obviously his arms were so much bigger than somebody like a Richard Belzer, who was just giving up his body too. So not a good look. I did like Mr. T yelling. I think I've said this before somewhere else, but oh, he's sleeping. Like that was his improvisational skills,
Yeah, because you could see clearly when Belzer's arms go down and then he just flops. And yeah, it's wild presenting things like that and being able to see the footage from that. And then they go to WrestleMania 1, making wrestling mainstream, which you could argue is the main event of this episode, kind of where it ends.
Right.
Because there is a brief preview of all the wrestling scandals, and those are the subject of episode 2. So overall, I thought episode 1 was a great kickoff to things. You got to see a lot of great footage. It brought me back to a lot of the memories of that time. And you get to hear Vince you get to hear from Vince firsthand about these things. So I thought episode 1 was great.
Absolutely. I've said the only other thing too we probably glossed over too is like right before WrestleMania would have been the Rock and Wrestling connection, which they talked about with Cyndi Lauper on a flight with Captain Lou and stuff like that. Does that get talked about here? No, that's episode 2, isn't it?
Yes, that does. That was kind of I lumped it in with my notes with working with Letterman, and then it went to MTV after that and talking about the rise of it. And it was talking about kind of Vince partnering up with all these brands.
And the reason why I got confused, because in episode 2, we're going to talk about the screw job. And that's why.
Oh, yeah. Episode 2, all the scandals you want to hear about Vince will be gone into. Maybe, I think we'll be able to add a little bit to it. My problem is I am such a fan of Post Wrestling, and I
Yeah.
listened to their review on it, and they do such a good job that I didn't want to do beat by beat like what they did, but they did have some thoughts that we brought up here today. So it's rare that we'll tell you to go hear somebody do what we're doing better. But if you enjoy great in-depth wrestling coverage, you'll get it from Post Wrestling. From us, you'll get an honest opinion. You'll get what little, knowledge we can bring to the subject. And you'll also get the four greatest flavors in the game, the flavors that are revolutionizing pro wrestling from Game Up Hard Hydration.
If you haven't tried Game Up, then you are missing out. Imagine your favorite seltzer and your favorite sports drink had a baby, but it's way better than that. Each can is 110 calories, low carb, 4.9 ABV. It's a nice light drink that is not light on flavor. Game Up comes in fruit punch, orange, lemon, lime, and grape. Pick it up at drinkgameup.com or at your nearest liquor store.